name is Andrea Jefferson, and this is my dissertation in practice, which I defended this spring. It is entitled The Accuracy of EdReady English as a Placement Tool at a Midwestern Community College Campus. This is an outline of my presentation, which will include background information, as well as a statement of the problem. I'll briefly explore previous research and my research questions. I'll discuss my methodology, the results of my study, and a discussion of the implications and suggestions for future research. Some background. Community colleges play a vital role in the ecosystem of higher education. In fact, about 1/3 of students who are enrolled in higher education attend community colleges. And because of their open access policies, which admit students of all levels of academic preparation, community colleges serve a large population of students who are of color, first generation, or Pell Grant students. In fact, they serve a larger number of students from these backgrounds than do four-year universities. And because of this, you can imagine that community colleges serve a democratizing role by making college available to students who may not be able to attend college otherwise. However, before most students can access community colleges, they must complete a placement test. And placement tests are in use at about 90% of community colleges across the country. These are the placement tests that are being utilized at most community colleges. There's the AccuPlacer ACT, the Compass, which was discontinued in 2016, the PSAT, and the SAT. And these tests are used to assess students' level of college readiness in math, reading, and writing. So when students come to community colleges in order to determine if they are ready for college level work, students must show their college readiness using their scores on one of these tests. Now, if students do not show college readiness in math, reading, and writing, they are frequently assigned to remedial courses. And these are classes that students take before they are able to take their college level or program level courses. And these remedial courses are designed to support students by strengthening their math, reading, and writing skills. These classes typically begin with a 0 and do not count towards a degree. And these classes are very prevalent. In fact, about 70% of community college students will take at least one remedial course, and the average student will take about 3 of these. However, the success rates in these remedial courses are mixed at best and poor at worst, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So when students take a placement test, their outcomes can be very critical. For example, when students take the placement test and they miss the cut score that is required to enroll in program level courses or college level courses, many students are not going to enroll in any classes, remedial or otherwise. And the students who do take remedial classes are often less likely to finish their degree or to transfer to a 4-year program. And even more critically, Black and Hispanic students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to be placed into remedial classes by a placement test than are students from other backgrounds. And this underscores the need to evaluate the accuracy of a placement test. Now, the problem is that studies have shown that placement tests often misplace students into remedial courses that they don't need. In fact, one landmark study found that 1/3 of the students who were placed into remedial English and 1/4 of the students who were placed into remedial math did not actually need those classes. And more critically, students who are in community colleges are more likely to be placed unnecessarily into remedial courses than are students from 4-year institutions, underscoring again the need to evaluate the accuracy of the measures that are being used to place students into these remedial courses. Now, because of challenges to placement accuracy, many community colleges are using alternate methods to assess students' college readiness because of placement or misplacement errors that occur because of tests like AccuPlacer, the PSAT, SAT, etc. So what you see here are some of the placement methods that are being used instead of a single placement test score: high school GPA, Self-placement, which is where the student is able to receive counseling about their options, and then the student chooses whether they want remediation or whether they want a test or place directly into a college level course. There's also a method called multiple measures, and this is where students are able to show their readiness using different metrics, like the highest math or English class they took, high school GPA, or personal preference, or sometimes just a combination thereof. And the final method is called modular instruction. And this is where students are able to use an online platform of some kind to take an initial diagnostic test. And then they are assigned modules based on their performance. And those modules are designed to help remediate the student, provide additional support so the student bypasses remediation courses altogether. Now, one such modular instruction method is called EdReady, and that is the subject of this work. EdReady is a new tool that is being used to place students in place of Accuracy or Compass, and it was developed by the NROC project. Now, this is a nonprofit that provides college and career preparation using an online repository of courses. EdReady provides individual online testing and instruction. There is a diagnostic test in both math and English. The student takes an 1 hour diagnostic test, and based on their score or their performance on the test, the student is then given a personalized set of online modules that contain content specifically targeted to their needs. So the subject of this particular study is EdReady English. It contains 10 units. The student takes the test and then will either test out of units if they show proficiency or be assigned content in the modules. Now, once the student takes the test, they receive a study path, and that study path is what contains all of their online content. It includes practice exercises, videos, and tests. The student can raise their score by working through the study path, and once the student has met the cut score, the student is then able to enroll in college level work. So this EdReady platform serves as both an initial placement diagnostic and as a remediative support. So the statement of the problem is that a large community college system in the Midwest began using EdReady as a placement tool in 2020. However, because it is fairly new as a placement metric, it is unknown how accurately EdReady is functioning as a placement test. And it is also unknown how students who are placed by EdReady English perform in their classes compared to those who are placed by other methods, such as SAT, ACT, etc. It all boils down to the question whether or not this tool is working well for students. So the large Midwestern Community College system uses multiple measures to test students' college readiness. Students can show their readiness using SAT scores, PSAT scores, ACT scores, or they can show that they can show their EdReady scores. And so the question now becomes, if we're using EdReady as a placement tool, is it working as well as some of the other methods? And that's what we don't know. So previous research has shown that there's some doubt cast on the accuracy of these placement methods that you see here. So ACT, Accuplacer, and SAT have been found to be not very predictive of how students will perform in their first math and English classes, first year math and English courses. And instead, many studies have found that high school GPA is the most predictive of how well students will perform in their first year courses. And this may be because high school GPA is collected over many years. It includes grades given by many teachers, and it may be reflective of students' attitudes or other affective issues like determination and focus, etc. We also know from previous research that English placement tests tend to be less accurate than math placement tests. And so even if we tested, for example, EdReady Math and found it to be quite predictive of students' performance in their first credit-bearing math course, we cannot assume that same is true for EdReady English, because English placement tests tend to be have a very weak predictive relationship in order to determine how well students will do in their first credit-bearing English courses. Now, the work that has been done on EdReady so far has been done on EdReady math. And this research has shown that students who test into their math courses using EdReady math tend to do as well or better than students who test into math using Accuracy or ACT. So this is promising. However, there is no extant research on how EdReady English performs and how it serves as a placement test. We just don't know, and we can't assume, given previous research, we can't assume that just because the test is working well for students in math, that it also works as well for students in English. In fact, many studies have shown that even if a placement test has strong validity, it has to be analyzed at every campus with every population. And therefore, that lays the groundwork for this study. We don't know how EdReady English is doing in general as a placement test. We don't have research on that. And even if we did have research on that, we would also need to do research at every single campus to determine how well the tool places students with specific populations. So here I have a list of my research questions. I had 3 major research questions. The first had to do with accuracy. How accurately does the EdReady English test place students into their first credit-bearing English course, which in this campus is called English 111. Now, English 111 is a first-year English course with a focus on composition and research. There are 2 parts to this first question. What is the relationship between students' scores on the EdReady placement test and their grades in the first credit-bearing English course? Now, the cut score for EdReady has been placed at 70 for the entire community college system. So this campus, students have to score a 70 on EdReady in order to place into that first credit-bearing English course. However, it is unknown if 70 is more indicative of a student's readiness than a 72 or an 80 or 90. So it was important to analyze each score and the grade in English 111 to determine if there was a relationship between higher scores on EdReady and higher grades in English 111. More specifically, I wanted to know research question 1B, which scores, if any, on the EdReady English placement test are predictive of a C or higher or a successful completion of that first credit-bearing course, English 111. So I was interested to know, do students who score 70 have higher grades in English 111? Or does it take a 90 or a 92? Or what is the relationship between that grade? And is there a correlation with higher grades and higher scores on EdReady and the higher grades in English 111? Now, the second question, research question 2, is grounded in equity. And this is because some research has shown that placement tests have varying outcomes for students of different subpopulations. So I wanted to know, how do the grades in the first credit-bearing English course vary for student subgroups, specifically by age, by race, and gender, those students who were placed by EdReady English? Specifically, are we noticing that certain subgroups are doing better or worse in English 111 when they are placed by EdReady English? And finally, I wanted to know, for research question 3, how do the English 111 grades of students who are placed by EdReady compared to the English 111 grades of students who are placed by all other criteria? So in the parentheses here, you'll see all the placement criteria used at this community college. AccuPlacer, which is the previous placement test that was used until EdReady replaced it, ACT scores, co-requisite. Now, a co-requisite is a remedial placement method where students are placed in the remedial course at the same time as they're taking their program level course. So this is a specific model where students are able to take the program level course and then receive additional support in the co-requisite remedial course. High school GPA has to be a 2.6 or higher. Students can also show a transcript which is able to prove that they already completed college coursework or a previous college degree. PSAT scores, having completed a remedial course with a C or higher, or the SATs. So you can see that EdReady is part of the multiple measures placement setup here at the large Midwestern Community College. So students who are not able to show their scores on any of these methods, or they're not able to show any of these, would then by default take EdReady English to get into the program level course, or they could always choose just to take remediation instead of taking the EdReady. So the purpose of this causal comparative quantitative study was to analyze the placement accuracy of the EdReady English tool that is being utilized at one campus of the large Midwestern Community College system. The research design was simple. The independent variable was the EdReady English score. The dependent variable was a student's grade in English 111. And looking at success rates, I define that as a C or higher. And this is because the community college system offers transfer pathways to four-year colleges, bachelor's programs across the state. And in order to receive successful completion of a course for the class to transfer, it must be a C or higher, which is considered successful in the community college. So I collected secondary data from fall 2020 to spring 2022. I looked at the English 111 grades of students who were placed by EdReady English I looked at the relationship of the grade to the score on EdReady. I examined it by student subgroup, including age, race, and gender. And then I compared the grades of students who were placed by EdReady to the grades of students who were placed by all of their placement methods. So there were 10 placement methods that students could use to get into English 111. And I looked at the grades of students for all placement methods in comparison to English, EdReady English. So for research question 1, looking at the relationship between students' scores on EdReady and their grades, I did a linear regression with a p-value of 0.05. For research question 1B, I looked at what scores on EdReady that were predictive or the relationship of scores on EdReady and grades of C or higher. I did a linear regression again for that one, which is a kind of a similar approach. For research question 2, looking at the grades of students in the first credit-bearing English course by student subgroups. For age, I used a Kruskal-Wallis H test because the grades were not the grades in the sample were not evenly distributed. We had not a normal distribution for grades. There was a high number of Fs, and so that created skewed data. For the race, I also used a Kruskal-Wallis H test. And then for gender, there were only 2 categories collected by the community college. So I used a Mann-Whitley U test. Again, we had to use non-parametric tests because the data was skewed. For research question 3, I looked at the grades of students in their first credit-bearing English course by placement method, and that was also a Kruskal-Wallis test, Kruskal-Wallis H test with a p-value of 0.05. The limitations of this research had mainly to do with the length of the study. Because the community college only started using EdReady in 2020, there isn't a lot of longitudinal data available. For example, we don't know the graduation completion metrics of students yet, given that they've only been, this is just now the 3rd year that EdReady has been used. So we're just beginning to have that information. Also, we have a limitation of the clarity of the EdReady data. So what this means is, because of proprietary restrictions, we have access to the score that a student got on EdReady, but we're not able to see how many times the students retook quizzes to get that score. So we have the student's final score in EdReady, but not how long they worked in the path or how many units they had to complete before they got that score. So if a student had a 70, I'm not able to see if the student got the 70 testing in the first time or if they worked for a few weeks to raise their score to a 70. Also, we can see the amount of time that students spent working in EdReady, but it's impossible to know if the student was really on task that entire time, or if, for example, the student started it and then maybe took a phone call and came back, that we're not able to see at this point. So that's why length of time, the amount of time the students worked in the study path, is not considered as a variable in this study. We also had some limited availability of demographic data. As I mentioned earlier, the community college only collects information on 2 genders, male and female. Therefore, it is unknown how students who were of other genders or other gender identities performed, because we don't. This community college doesn't collect that information, nor do we know the socioeconomic status of students in the study. So that information was limited as well. And then finally, obviously, the big limitation was the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, this information was collected during the height of COVID-19 lockdown procedures. During this time, the community college system went virtual with their courses, so students were taking classes via Zoom, and also testing centers were closed. So students could not take the PSAT, the SAT, or the ACT, or any of those proctored exams because of COVID lockdown procedures. So Again, those are some of the limitations that might affect the data in this study. Moving on to the participants, you can see here that there were 948 students who took English 111 during the time of data collection. The majority of those students placed using EdReady English. Again, we don't know if this was because of the COVID-19 lockdowns, where there were nationally fewer students who took SAT or ACT because those proctored exams were not, those proctored exam locations were not open. The second largest group was tested in using a high school GPA. And then you can see that students who had previous coursework were the third most popular groups, followed by the rest, which were much, much smaller. These are the grades of the students in the study. There were 292 A's, which looks really great. But if you look at this section over here, okay, so these are the W's. These are students who withdrew from the class after the drop period. So there's a W on the transcript. These are FW's. So these are students who stopped coming to class. So they didn't withdraw. So they failed the class, but it wasn't a withdrawal. It was an FW, meaning they failed the class, but didn't withdraw, but they just didn't take the final exam. And then we have the F. So when you combine all of these, we have 300 and some odd failures. So the withdrawals, the FWs, and the Fs all count as failures. Now, understandably, a withdrawal doesn't necessarily mean a failure. A student could withdraw from the class for many reasons, personal reasons that are not necessarily a failure, but because they don't complete the class, we have to count it as a failure because the student started the class but didn't finish it. And the student withdrawing from the class could, although it could reflect a lot of personal issues, it could also reflect that the student did not feel adequately prepared for the class. And if the students who were placed into that class by a certain placement method tend to withdraw a lot, that could give us useful information about the preparedness of students who use that placement method. So that W was counted in this study as a failure. The study had primarily students who identified as white, with a smaller group that identified as Black or African American, and the third largest group were students of 2 or more races. Predominantly female in the study. Most of the students were female, 331, and then a smaller group of male students and a few that were not reported. But again, I mentioned earlier that the only categories available are male or female, so we might see that the not reported were students who didn't feel that the categories reflected their identities, which is understandable. And then we're looking at the participants by placement method. You can see that students who had a previous degree were the oldest students in the study, and then students who took the placed using the ACT, high school GPA, PSAT, and SAT were all fairly young, mean age of 18. So we're looking at students who were just graduated from high school. Looking at that information, then we can see that our EdReady English group is kind of right in the middle. So the students with previous degree or previous coursework, those students tended to be older. EdReady is kind of right in the middle. And if you remember that I mentioned earlier that Accuracy was the placement test that was being used instead of EdReady. So EdReady English and Accuracy students are kind of about the same age. So I'm now going to discuss my findings. So this is going to be where I'm going to discuss what I found, and then we'll proceed with a conversation about the implications. So here's what we found. In my research, I found that there was a difference in the percentage of students by placement method who had a successful completion. So as a reminder, a successful completion is a C or higher. So you can see here that students who placed into English 111 using a previous degree had the highest success rate. Well, that makes sense, given that these students have already completed college and are familiar with the methods and strategies and mindsets required. About almost 90% of those students completed with a C or higher. Previous coursework was the second highest group. 75.95% of those students got a C or higher in English 111. So C or higher would tend to indicate that the placement method is a good match for the course. So if a student places into a course and does really well, that is the suggestion that the score that they received on whatever placement method or that placement method is sufficiently predictive of how well the student would do. If they do well on the test, they do well in the course, those are a good match. So that's what we're looking for here. We noticed that students who had a high school GPA, they did pretty well. About 71% of them had a C or higher. But if we look at EdReady English, only 56.2% of those students had a C or higher. So that sort of maybe creates some pause or some questions. If students who are testing in by EdReady English, only 56% of them are getting a C or higher in English 111, it makes one wonder if those students are actually ready for the course. And we also see that there are varying success rates. So students who tested in using remedial coursework, out of 70% of them got a C or higher, but do keep in mind that there were only 10 students in that sample. So kind of across the board there, you can see how well students did earning a C or higher in English 111. We also want to look at withdrawals because, as I mentioned earlier, students who withdraw from a course may withdraw because of personal life reasons, and that's certainly valuable. However, if there is a large number of withdrawals in a class, it's important to consider if students in that class get in the class and then find that they are not academically prepared. And that would give us useful information about the accuracy of the placement. So you can see that students with a previous degree, no students withdrew from English 111, so that would tend to suggest that students felt adequately prepared. Previous coursework had a low withdrawal rate. High school GPA, only 6.9% of those students withdrew. But if you can see, EdReady English, 11% of students withdrew. Now, that's not as high as students who took Accuplacer, which was 16.67%, or the PSAT. So again, we can see that EdReady English is kind of in the middle here. 11.6% of students who tested in using EdReady English withdrew. That's higher than some of these other placement methods, but also lower than others. And remember, remedial coursework, this group had only 10 students in the sample as well. So the findings there have to be sort of taken with a grain of salt, given that it's only reflects 10 students. So more research would need to be done there. Also want to consider failure rates. And this is important because if students who are placed into the class by a particular method have a high failure rate, that would also suggest that placement method may not be as close of a match. If students who are placed into the class by a particular placement method have a low failure rate, that would tend to suggest that students were adequately prepared for that class. So you can see that high school GPA had a kind of a low failure rate, 8%. Previous degree, of course, had the lowest, 3%. Previous coursework was about 7%. ACT also had a lower with failure rate, but EdReady English had a 13% failure rate, which is comparable to the PSAT, a little lower than the co-requisite model, and a little bit higher than students who placed in using the SAT. So again, kind of in the middle on failure rates. On the low end, though, and on the high end of failure rates, I guess would be a better way of saying that. So now I'm going to discuss what I found using my research question. So for research question 1A, looking at what is the relationship between student scores on the EdReady English placement tests and their grades in the first credit-bearing English course, the regression found that there was no relationship between the EdReady score and the grade. So I ran a scatter plot, and it was all over the place. There was no pattern that emerged. And then I looked at each grade. I looked at an A only, a B only, a C only, just to see if there was a pattern that emerged. And the scores were all over the map. There are students that scored a perfect score on EdReady and failed English 111. And so the regression showed that the EdReady English score explained just 0.3% of the variability. So that's a very weak relationship, meaning that the EdReady score was found to not have any sort of predictive relationship to the grade in English 111. There was no linear relationship and no strong relationship was found. And then research question 1B, again, there was not a linear relationship between any EdReady score and a grade of C or higher. In fact, the EdReady English score explained just 0.4% of the variability of the English 111 grade of a C or higher. For research question 2, when I looked at age, there was a significant difference in the median English 111 grades for students who were ages 14 to 19 who had a median grade of a D, and students who were 32 and older who had a median grade of a B. So there were differences between those two age categories. There were not differences among any of the other age categories, but the youngest students, 14 to 19, and the older students, 32 and up, had a statistically significant relationship or statistically significant differences in those grades. When I looked at the race categories, there were not any statistically significant differences in any of the racial categories. All the students had very similar grades in English 111. And then when I looked at gender, there were no statistically significant differences between males and females. They both had a median grade of a C in the class. For the final research question, how did the English 111 grades of students placed by EdReady compared to the English 111 grades of students placed by all other criteria? There were statistically significant differences between placement groups, and a post hoc test found that there were differences in English 111 grades of students who were placed by EdReady English, who had a median grade of a C, and the students who were placed by high school GPA, who had a median grade of a B. But there were not statistically significant differences found among any of the other groups. So now I would like to talk about what these findings mean or how I interpreted them, and also make some suggestions for future research. So the biggest finding of the study is that there was not a strong relationship, in fact, a very, very weak relationship between the EdReady English score and a student's grade in English 111. Now, what this means is the English EdReady score doesn't really tell us how well students are going to perform in English 111. So as far as predictive validity goes, that is very low for EdReady English. However, I'll talk about this later, but that is a typical finding for English placement tests. Another significant finding is that there were similar English 111 grades for most student subgroups. So this is positive news because sometimes we find that students who were placed by a particular method, students of different racial groups don't perform as well when they're placed by that group and the first credit bearing English course as students in other groups. And that then becomes an issue of equity, right? So now this finding obviously can't determine whether there's bias in the placement test or if their students experience the test differently, but students of all racial groups who were tested by EdReady English, there was not a statistically significant difference in how well they did in English 111. And that's positive because we would hope that the test would assess students equitably across groups. The same was true for gender. So we can say based on the results of this test that students who were placed by EdReady English, whether they were male or female, did as well in English 111 as statistically similarly across racial and gender groups, which is a positive finding. And we also found that for the most part, students who were placed by EdReady English, although you could see that they had sort of higher failure rates than some groups, and they had lower success rates than some groups, but those differences were not statistically significant. Overall, students who tested into English 111 using EdReady English did as well as students of all other groups except high school GPA. And so this seems to suggest that EdReady English is doing as well as other placement methods at identifying students who can be successful in English 111, given that students who were placed by EdReady statistically had similar grades as students of all placement groups except high school GPA. Now, just because there were no statistically significant differences, doesn't mean there wasn't some important information to come out of the study. So there were 3 groups of students that had placement groups that had low success rates, high failure rates, and high withdrawal rates. Now, these 3 combined tend to paint a picture about college readiness. And what I mean by that is if there is a group of students who tend to have low success rates, that doesn't necessarily mean the placement method isn't accurate, but if you combine that with a high failure rate and a high withdrawal rate, that tends to paint a picture that those students in that placement group are not very prepared for the course. So the 3 groups in the study that had low success rates, high failure rates, and high withdrawal rates were Accuracy, EdReady English, and students who took the PSAT. Now, this suggests to me a couple of possibilities. It could be that students in these placement groups have lower levels of academic preparation and need additional support in order to do well in English 111. It also suggests to me that students in these three groups have similar levels of academic preparation, given that they have similar outcomes in English 111. Another important finding of the study is that high school GPA was again found to be more predictive of student success in English 111 than any placement test. So I just wanted to show you side by side what I noticed about this study. So high school GPA outperforms EdReady in every metric. So when we look at success rates, students who use their high school GPA had a much higher success rate identified as a C or higher than students who used EdReady English. Students who used high school GPA had a much lower failure rate than students who used EdReady English. The FW rate, students who stopped attending and failed because of it, that's much lower for high school GPA, and the withdrawal rate is almost half, right? Almost half FW, half FW, almost half withdrawal rate here. So this is important to notice because this confirms research that showed in previous studies that high school GPA is still the most accurate predictor of success. However, this is sort of understandable. To add some context, in order to get into English 111 at this community college system, you have to have a 2.6 in high school GPA and a Core 40 diploma or higher. So obviously students that weren't able to show that GPA are using EdReady English. So this EdReady English group of students may be prepared academically. They might have different levels of academic preparation than students who use their high school GPA. So we might be looking at two different groups altogether. However, this study does support the finding that high school GPA is a more accurate predictor than a placement test. Now, this is an important research that has a high impact on the field because, first of all, it fills the gap in the research on EdReady English. At this point, there hasn't been any, has no existing research at this time on how EdReady English is doing, especially considering the score on EdReady English and the grade. So previous studies that looked at EdReady have looked at math only. And what they did was they looked at the students who tested in using EdReady Math and their score in the math first credit bearing math course. So there hasn't been any examination of the score and the relationship to the grade. So this is the first study, as far as I know, that does that. And the first study to look at how well EdReady English is functioning as a placement tool in a college setting. So something that's really important is that this study found that there was not a relationship between EdReady English, the EdReady English score and the English 111 grade. And this is important because when we make students take a placement test, we give them an additional hurdle that they have to jump over to get to college. And community college students sort of historically often have many hurdles in their life. And so by the time they get to college and they're ready to go to college and they want to be there, we don't want to give them any hurdles to their education that they don't need. And we know specifically from previous research that shows that when students don't meet the cut score, they often don't enroll in any classes. It serves as a deterring effect. So if there's no relationship between the score and the English 111 grade, and it's not particularly predictive, it sort of makes one wonder why we're doing it. If we cannot show that there's a strong relationship, then it sort of calls into question whether the test is really useful for its purposes. Now, positively, we found that students who were tested by EdReady had similar outcomes by student subgroups, except age. So it doesn't seem like there's a harm in having students take the test because they're performing in English 111 as well by race and gender. And it's comparable, their performance is comparable. However, again, if there isn't a strong relationship between the score and their grade, then I wonder if it's necessary for them to take the test in the first place. And some research has shown that it would be more equitable to place students directly into their first credit bearing course rather than having them take a placement test that could misplace them into remediation. So one of the implications of this study is that students who were placed by EdReady English, even though they do as well as students who placed by other methods, they do have high failure rates and high withdrawal rates and low success rates. So it's pretty clear that students who test using EdReady English will need probably more support either working through the study path or additional coaching or tutoring in English 111 to be successful. Now, again, something that I didn't mention earlier is that students in the study, the majority of their scores, about 70% of their scores, were 70 or 71. So that suggests to me that most students, once they reach the cut score, are not working through the study path anymore because they're getting the 70 or 71, they're stopping there and then they're enrolling. And so it's possible that students may need more coaching to work through the path, or it's obviously possible that the cut score could be set higher. And then because there were differences in the way that students who were 14 and 19 scored in English 111 and students 32 and up, it may be that students who are younger who test into English 111 using EdReady, they may need additional academic support. Also, the study found that high school GPA is still the strongest predictor of success in that first credit-bearing course. Students who use their GPA to get into the course did typically very well. And so when policymakers and college leaders are deciding what metrics they want to use for placement, high school GPA, this study found, is still the strongest indicator. So because there were no unequitable grade outcomes by race or gender, it seems appropriate then to use EdReady English for various populations, given that there weren't outcomes aside from age, seemed to equitably place students. Of course, we would have to do qualitative work to find out if students experience that test differently. So there's still information that we need to gather, but initial data showed that they did as well by race and gender. And also because EdReady English is as accurate as other placement methods, then it's possible that it could be used in place of AccuPlacer or alongside other placement metrics. However, as we noted, there wasn't a strong relationship between the score and the grade in English 111. So it's as accurate as any placement method, but again, English placement methods are not typically very accurate. So I would suggest using EdReady as part of a multiple measures placement policy. So the EdReady score could be considered in light of other information when placing a student. Or I also think it could make sense as a self-placement model, meaning that the student could take the EdReady placement test and then based on the information they got from the test, make a decision about whether they wanted to take remediation or not. Because again, the score isn't really predictive of how well they're going to do in English 111. So to me, it makes more sense to use this as part of a multiple measures placement model, or to help give advisors or students information about their levels of preparedness so that they can make an informed decision. Lots of ideas for future research. Again, we don't know the long-term outcomes of how students who are placed by EdReady English perform, for example, their completion rates, their degree attainment, whether their transfer rates are as good as students who test using other methods. So it's important to gather that long-term data in the future, specifically because the time during which this data was collected was during the height of COVID-19 restrictions. And so it would be important in the future to see if the strength of the relationship, the predictive validity, grows or weakens as we collect data over many years. Again, we also need to research how students understand the study path, how they're using the study path. Specifically, not all students who were assigned to take the study path probably participated in it. This study just looked at students who took English 111. So it would be important to gather information like whether students started the study path but just didn't finish it. Students who scored under 70, did they enroll in classes? Did they take remediation? Did they not enroll in any classes? So I think understanding the study path would be vital. For example, it might be important to look at what units students were assigned, and if those units had a strong relationship to students' grades, if their amount of time students spent in the study path was correlated or had a relationship to students' grades. So digging in a little bit more to the study path and unpacking that, I think would be useful for future research. Also, we don't have qualitative research at all about EdReady. So previous research, there's been some done to do interviews of students to understand how they experience the placement method. That could shed some light on if there are inequities in the process. For example, if students of different subgroups understand or experience EdReady differently, if they encounter different barriers, and also just to understand why students are stopping after they get a 70 or 71, and the students who do continue working in the path until they get 100, it'd be interesting to know what made them do that, what advice they received, what messages they're receiving about the study path. So just qualitative research is really critical, because even though we know the what, we don't really know the why. And so I think qualitative research would be enormously helpful here. We also don't know the relationship between the score on other placement methods and the grade in English 111. So this study found that there was not a strong relationship between the EdReady score and the grade in English 111, but we don't know if that relationship is stronger for ACT score in English 111 grade, or if higher GPAs are linked to higher success in English 111. So duplicating the study with the other placement methods could help us understand if EdReady English, even though it has a weak relationship, is it less predictive than other methods, or more, or the same? And then finally, because different campuses of this community college have different student demographics, it would be important to replicate this research at other campuses to determine if EdReady English is more predictive at other campuses than it is at the one in this particular study. So overall, I just want to reiterate that EdReady English was found to be as predictive as other methods except high school GPA, which was somewhat more predictive. And so for me, that means that EdReady English, as far as an English placement test goes, is adequate. However, I would say that because it was the relationship between the EdReady score and the English 111 grade was very weak, I would just suggest that EdReady English be, instead of being used as a sole placement method, being used as part of a multi-measures algorithm, or being used in conjunction with other information to help advisors and students make decisions about their courses. So I'd like to thank you for watching this, and I'm gonna go through my sources here, and I'll show my email address. If you have any questions about the studies, or ideas of something I didn't consider, or something you'd like to know more about, please give me an email. I'd love to chat with you about this research. And I just encourage you, as you go out into your spaces, to think about entry points. A lot of times when we're thinking about college, we think about those first courses. We don't think about how students even got in the college in the first place. And placement tests are at a very important entryway, important gateway. And so I'm very passionate about making sure those gateways are accurate and equitable. And so I just encourage you in your own spaces, when you think about your programs, what you offer, always consider the entry point. What's that like for students? And if there's anything occurring that might be a barrier for students, it's really important to analyze it, to determine if it's necessary, and to remove it if it's not. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.